The Ithran ambassador watched the human woman eat a ghost pepper for fun, and quietly revised humanity's threat assessment for the third time that evening. It was a small gesture, barely worth noticing by human standards. A woman at a diplomatic reception, popping a small red pod into her mouth between sentences, laughing at something a colleague said, wiping one watering eye with the back of her hand, and reaching for more before she'd even swallowed. Ambassador Rel Ashen had been briefed, extensively, on human anatomy before this posting. Nothing in those briefings had prepared her for the sight of a sentient being deliberately consuming a compound her own species' toxicology division had flagged, in bright red letters, as capable of inducing organ failure in an Ithran within minutes. She had watched, over the course of that single reception, humans eat things that struck her as a slow-motion catalog of small, controlled disasters. A dish of raw fish, sliced thin, eaten cold, and completely unseasoned by fire the way every sane species prepared its protein. A soup that arrived, according to the human server, still working, bubbling faintly with cultures that were, near as Rel could translate the concept, deliberately alive. A dessert made from milk that had been allowed to sour on purpose, aged in a cave, presented with something close to reverence by a species that had apparently decided, at some point in its long history, that food left just past the edge of spoiled was not a tragedy to be avoided but an achievement to be celebrated. "She's fine," said Rel's aide, a young botanist named Son Vei, watching the same scene with an expression somewhere between horror and fascination. "She's laughing, Ambassador." That substance registers as agony on their own pain scale. Their medical records confirm it, and she is laughing. "Add it to the file," Rel said quietly. "Which file? The one where we stop assuming we understand what humans are capable of eating and start asking instead what precisely they cannot." It would take the Ithran delegation 4 more months, and one catastrophic accident on a moon nobody had bothered to properly survey, to learn just how short that second list actually was. The Ithran had evolved on a world with exactly one reliable food source. Velic root grew across 9% of Ithra's surface, a slow, patient tuber that had shaped every part of Ithran biology across 400,000 years of quiet, undisturbed evolution. Ithran digestive systems had specialized so completely around its precise chemistry that anything else, virtually anything else, passed through an Ithran gut either useless or actively dangerous. It was not weakness, exactly. Rel's people had built cities and starships, and a civilization spanning 11 systems on the strength of that specialization, because a species that never has to worry about what it eats has a great deal of extra time to spend building everything else. But it was a narrow kind of strength, a single point of failure 400,000 years wide. Humans, Rel had learned, were the opposite kind of animal entirely, and it was that difference, small and almost comedic at first glance, that ended up saving 11 Ithran lives on a frozen moon called Kessel's Hollow 11 weeks after the Pepper incident. The joint survey mission had been Rel's idea, in fact, a goodwill gesture 2 years into formal contact. A small crew of Ithran and human specialists sent to catalog a mineral-rich moon on the edge of both species-claimed territory. 11 Ithran, 4 humans, 1 battered survey shuttle called the Long Reach, and a moon that turned out to have considerably worse weather patterns than either species' orbital scans had predicted. The storm hit without warning on the 4th day, an electromagnetic squall violent enough to fry the shuttle's main array and send it down hard into a valley 200 kilometers from the extraction point. And when the dust settled, Master Sergeant Diego Marlowe found himself standing in 6 inches of gray volcanic ash, doing a headcount of 15 very frightened people and 1 shuttle that would never fly again. The impact had torn the Long Reach open along her port side like a can peeled back by a careless hand, and for the first 10 minutes nobody spoke much, because everybody was too busy checking for blood, checking for breath, checking the faces of colleagues to make sure the count still added up to 15. It did. Barely. Lieutenant Commander Alice Farrow had a fractured wrist and a concussion bad enough that she kept asking the same question twice, 3 minutes apart, without noticing she'd already asked it. Diego was not the ranking officer. That distinction belonged to Pharaoh, who had ordered rest she kept ignoring. Diego was, by any formal measure, the least important human on that shuttle. He was the cook. He had spent most of his career being the quietest, most overlooked person in every room he'd ever worked in, and none of that had prepared anyone, including Diego himself, for the fact that he was about to become the single most important person on that moon. "Supplies," Pharaoh said from her cot, voice tight with pain. "Diego, inventory now." He didn't need long. 3 days of emergency rations for 15 people, most of it human-formulated, none of it edible by Ithran biology, which required Velic-derived nutrient paste that had been stored with grim irony in the one cargo hold that had ruptured on impact, contaminated beyond any hope of recovery. Caro Dunn, the mission's Ithran medic, did the math out loud because someone needed to. Without Velic paste, Ithran physiology begins measurable organ decline within 4 days, severe failure within 8. We have 11 Ithran crew on this moon and 0 grams of edible nutrition among us. I am sorry. I do not know how to solve this problem. I have never had to. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Diego Marlowe stood up, brushed ash off his knees, and did the only thing he actually knew how to do, which was to start looking for food. "Give me 6 hours," he said, and grabbed a pack. He came back 4 hours later with a satchel full of things that looked, to every Ithran watching him unload them onto a tarp, deeply unpromising. Gray-green lichen, pale, waxy fungal growths, something that looked unsettlingly like a worm but moved like a root, a handful of hard, bitter berries. "You cannot possibly be suggesting we eat that," said Son Vey. "I'm not suggesting it," Diego said, pulling a battered field kit out of his pack. "I'm gonna test it myself first, every single item in small enough amounts that if something in here tries to kill me, it'll have plenty of warning before it gets the chance to try the rest of you." "That is an unacceptable risk," Caro Dunn said sharply. "Ma'am, respectfully," Diego said, not looking up. "I've been eating things that were trying to kill me since I was 9 years old, when my grandmother took me foraging in a forest that specialized in things that looked exactly like food and weren't. This is kind of my whole deal. Let me do my job." He didn't tell her the rest of it then. How his grandmother had grown up poor enough that a bad harvest meant a bad winter. How she taught him which mushrooms killed you slow and which killed you fast, and told him once, snapping a stem to check the color inside, "There's always something left to work with, Diego. You just have to be willing to look at it different than everybody else is looking at it." It took him 2 more hours to run every crude field test his kit could manage. Then, with 11 Ithran crew members watching in total silence, he ate a piece the size of his thumbnail, sat back and waited. Nothing happened for 11 minutes. Then he ate a piece twice as large. "You could die," Son Vey said quietly. "Statistically, less likely than you'd think," Diego said, chewing. "Humans have been eating things that were trying to kill us for about 300,000 years. It's not bravery, ma'am. It's homework. Very old, very stubborn homework, written in blood by about 4,000 generations of people who really didn't want to starve." By the following morning, 11 Ithran crew were eating boiled lichen, roasted rootworm, and a passable stew. It did not go smoothly. On the second day, a technician named Vess ate a piece of fungal cap Diego had marked as still needing testing, and within 20 minutes was doubled over, retching, breathing gone shallow. Diego was at his side in seconds. "Talk to me. Where's it sitting, chest or gut?" "Gut. I can't breathe right." "That's the panic, not the plant," Diego said steady, though his own heart was hammering. "You're not dying, Vess, I promise you that, but you are gonna feel like garbage for about an hour, and that one's on me." "You said this was safe," Caro Dunn said, furious and afraid. "I said I was testing it," Diego said. "I'd rather lose a batch to a bad reaction I catch in one man than feed something untested to 11 of you at once. That's the whole ugly math of this job, and I hate it, but it's the only math that keeps people alive out here." Vess refused to eat anything else for 2 full days after that, growing weaker, until Son Vey carried 2 bowls out to where he sat alone, set one down between them and said, "I'm not going to make you, but I'm going to eat mine right here next to you until you're ready." He ate in silence for nearly 40 minutes. Somewhere in the 35th, Vess's hand moved toward his own bowl. Diego slept maybe 3 hours a night for the 6 days it took the rescue beacon to bring a ship, testing new sources, adjusting recipes, until he had a rotation of 5 dishes Ithran's stomachs could reliably tolerate, including a thin, savory broth that Caro Dunn admitted, grudgingly and only once, reminded her faintly of something her own grandmother used to make from Velic root, which from a woman raised on 400,000 years of certainty that nothing else could taste like home, was as close to a compliment as Diego was ever going to get. By the time the rescue shuttle set down, all 15 crew members walked onto it under their own power. Ambassador Rel Ashen found Diego in the mess hall 3 days later, already elbow-deep in flour, teaching Son Vei and a still nervous Vess how to render fat from a cut of meat neither had considered edible 3 weeks earlier. "I am told you saved 11 of my people using lichen, a root that resembles a worm and considerable stubbornness," she said. "That's about the size of it, Ambassador. How does a species survive, across 300,000 years, on a willingness to eat literally anything the universe puts in front of it? My people built our civilization around perfecting one relationship with one food source. Yours seems built around never trusting any single source enough to depend on it completely. It seems exhausting." Diego set down the mixing bowl. "I think you've got it a little backwards, Ambassador. It's not that we don't trust any one thing. It's that a long time ago we figured out the one thing you actually can trust is that the world's gonna change on you eventually, whether you're ready or not. A species that only knows how to eat one thing doesn't survive that kind of world. So we specialized in the willingness to figure out the next one, whatever it turned out to be. Wasn't really about being brave, Ambassador. It was just about not being picky at exactly the moment it mattered most." Rel was quiet a moment. "And if Vess had not recovered, would you have kept going regardless?" Diego didn't answer right away. "I've asked myself that about 400 times since it happened. I don't have a clean answer. I know I would have grieved him for the rest of my life if it had gone the other way. I also know 10 more people were going to start failing within days if I stopped testing out of fear. So the honest answer is there wasn't a version of that week where I got to feel good about every choice I made. There was just a version where fewer people died than the alternative. That's not heroism, ma'am. That's just what the math looked like from where I was standing." Rel watched Son Vei render fat exactly as Diego had shown him, watched Vess taste the result, and for the first time in 3 weeks smile. "I think our threat assessments about your species have been asking the wrong question for 2 years. We kept asking what humans could do to us. Nobody thought to ask what a species learns, across 300,000 years of never being able to count on a single meal, about keeping other people alive when everything else has already gone wrong. I believe we have been very lucky it was the second question that mattered on that moon, and not the first." Diego picked the mixing bowl back up, because the bread wasn't going to make itself, and behind him Vess was already asking, in halting but determined English, whether there was any more of the stew left over from Kessel's Hollow, because for the first time in his life, he wanted to taste something new on purpose, instead of only because he had no other choice. "There's always more stew," Diego said, and smiled and got back to work. Rel Ashen stayed a while longer, thinking back to that first reception, the pepper, the soup still faintly alive, the milk aged deliberately past ruined habits she'd once filed under strange, mildly alarming. Standing in a mess hall that smelled of rendered fat and boiling broth, she found she wanted to rewrite that file entirely. Not recklessness, but readiness, worn so deep into a species' bones it had started to look, to outside eyes, like an appetite for chaos. It was never chaos. It was 300,000 years of refusing to let hunger become the end of the story.